Every road ends somewhere. Some end in silence, others in something far worse. For Michael, it ended at a forgotten pit where echoes never die. Welcome back, everyone, to Stories That Shouldn't Be Told. Tonight's episode is about a storm-swept night, voices that came from nowhere, and the valley that still remembers his name. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with anyone who loves a good scare. Your support keeps the stories alive. Now, let's begin. Michael was 34 years old when he decided to go camping alone in the Cascade Mountains after losing his job. He needed to clear his head, so he drove to a remote valley he'd discovered years earlier, a place where an old logging road dead-ended at an abandoned gravel pit surrounded by thick forest. He'd heard from a park ranger once that there had been some kind of accident here decades ago. Something about workers who went missing during a storm, but the details were always vague. What drew him back was how sounds seemed to bounce strangely off the valley walls, creating eerie echoes that could make your own voice sound like it was coming from someone else. It was late afternoon when Michael arrived, and storm clouds were already gathering overhead. He set up his tent near a small creek, hidden between towering pine trees. The first drops of rain began falling as he finished securing his camp. Perfect, he thought. The sound of rain always helped him think. As darkness fell, the rain turned into a heavy downpour. Michael was reading inside his tent when he heard something that made his blood freeze. Strange sounds coming from the forest. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth, and something else, something metallic that made his nose wrinkle. His heart started racing. At first, he thought it might be animals, but then he heard voices. At least 3 of them, maybe more. They were laughing and talking, but something was wrong with how they sounded. The voices were distorted, with words stretched impossibly long. Me times crackle times chail. And sometimes the syllables came out backwards, like cha times gurgle times el me. Between words, there were wet sounds, like static mixed with bubbling water. The sounds echoed strangely through the valley, bouncing back and forth until it was impossible to tell where they originated. Michael quietly unzipped his tent and peered out into the darkness. There were no flashlights, but during brief flashes of lightning, he caught glimpses of tall, dark shapes moving between the trees, shapes that seemed too long and thin to be human. The metallic smell was stronger now, mixing with the rain-soaked earth. The voices grew louder, calling his name in that same stretched-out way. Me times static times chail. Where are times click, click times you. Me times gurgle times kale. Sometimes the words came out completely backwards. Lay times crackle times came. Lay times pop times came. The sounds echoed off the valley walls, creating a chorus of distorted voices, broken by wet clicking noises that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Michael's hands shook as he reached for his phone. No signal. The voices were circling his campsite now, but instead of normal footsteps, he heard something else. Quick, rhythmic sounds like bouncing or leaping through the undergrowth. Whatever was making those sounds was moving much faster than anything human should be able to move through dense forest in the dark. The laughter was getting more frequent and more disturbing, high-pitched shrieks that echoed off the valley walls. Then the bouncing sounds stopped. Complete silence, except for the rain pounding against his tent. Michael held his breath, straining to hear any sound that might tell him where they were. Minutes passed. Then he felt it. Someone pressing their hand against the outside of his tent, right where his back was. The pressure moved slowly along the tent wall, following the outline of his body. A whisper came from inches away, the words unnaturally drawn out and interrupted by wet, mechanical sounds. We can times click, times see you, in times gurgle, times thee. Me times crackle, times chail. We've been times static times. Watching you for. So times pop pop, times low. Michael grabbed his hunting knife and slashed through the back wall of his tent. He crawled out into the rain and started running blindly through the forest. Behind him, he heard an explosion of laughter and the sound of his tent being torn apart. As he stumbled through the darkness, he could hear them pursuing him, not running, but making those same quick, bouncing sounds, like they were leaping from tree to tree or jumping enormous distances with each bound. The sounds were getting closer, and sometimes he heard heavy impacts against tree trunks, as if they were ricocheting off the bark. He ran for what felt like hours before finally reaching his truck, constantly hearing those quick, bouncing sounds following him through the forest. Even as he fumbled with his keys, he could hear them getting closer, that strange, leaping movement that seemed to cover ground impossibly fast. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. As he drove away, something landed on his roof with a heavy thud, then another and another. He floored the accelerator and heard scratching sounds above his head as whatever was up there struggled to hold on. The scratching continued for several miles before finally stopping. When Michael looked in his rearview mirror, he saw dark shapes bounding between the trees alongside the road, keeping pace with his truck, even at 40 miles per hour. The next morning, Michael called the sheriff's office to report the incident. When deputies went to investigate, they found his campsite completely destroyed, tent shredded, gear scattered everywhere. But they didn't find any footsteps in the muddy ground except for Michael's own. Despite all the destruction and Michael's account of being pursued through the forest, there was no trace that anyone or anything else had ever been there. Michael never went camping alone again, but sometimes, on rainy nights, he still hears that broken voice calling his name from somewhere in the darkness outside his bedroom window. Me times crackle times chail, me times static times chail, punctuated by those same wet clicking sounds. He's learned never to look outside when this happens, keeping his curtains drawn tight and his eyes fixed on anything else in the room. On the worst nights, he hears faint tapping against his window that follows the same quick, rhythmic pattern as those bouncing sounds from the forest. Years have passed, but Michael still wonders what was following him that night. Were they the missing loggers from the old accident, trapped somehow in that echoing valley, or something else entirely? The question that haunts him most is whether they stopped following him, or if they're still out there, waiting patiently in the rain. Sometimes he catches that metallic smell on humid nights, and he knows they haven't forgotten about him. He wonders what would have happened if they had caught him in those dark woods, and prays he'll never find out. And that was the end of tonight's story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that should never be told. And let me know in the comments, what are your favorite types of horror stories? Your support keeps these echoes alive, and there are many more waiting in the dark. Until next time, sleep well if the queue